Welcome to Punishment in the High Country. We are your hosts, Taylor Bullman
and Emily Presto.
This podcast is produced by senior criminology and criminal justice students at Northern Arizona University and examines the United States prison system, specifically how incarceration and inequality impact individuals and communities in California and Arizona.
In this episode, we will focus on how forced sterilization has impacted the reproductive rights and maternal health of incarcerated Indigenous women.
Incarceration is not just about confinement, it is also about control. For Indigenous women in particular, this control has historically included their bodies, choices, and ability to reproduce children. We will discuss how this unfair treatment began with colonization and is still happening today.
We will also be sharing the perspective of Dr. Ariel Roddy, a professor at Northern Arizona University, whose research examines the intersection of colonialism and incarceration in the lives of Indigenous women. By sharing her insight, our goal is to educate and provide a clear understanding of what Indigenous women experience while incarcerated.
Can you imagine being arrested, sentenced to prison, a punishment in itself, and then being forcibly sterilized, losing the ability to have children without your consent? If that sounds unbelievable, think again. Thousands of Indigenous women, poor women, and women of color have experienced forced sterilization in the United States.
Marie Sanchez, a Northern Cheyenne tribal judge, shared that after the Family Planning Services and Population Research Act of 1970, doctors sterilized around 25% of Native American women of childbearing age over the next 6 years. Some evidence suggests that the actual number was even higher.
That number says a lot, and it is important to understand what forced sterilization really means. The International Justice Resource Center explains forced sterilization as when an individual is no longer able to have children against their will.
Sterilization often involves procedures like removing or damaging the fallopian tubes, making it impossible to get pregnant. It is not just a violation of human rights, but it can also be considered genocide, gender-based violence, discrimination, and even torture.
That is a crucial point. And when we look at the history of forced sterilization in California, we can see how harmful this practice is.
California played a large role in the eugenics movement by passing harsh laws that influenced sterilization practices and were even followed by Hitler as he created policies targeting marginalized individuals and people with disabilities.
For many survivors of forced sterilization, the impact was devastating. One woman shared how it shattered her dreams of having a family. She said,
"It was like my life wasn't worth anything. Somebody felt I had nothing to contribute to the point where they had to find this sneaky and diabolical way to take my ability to have children."
That really shows how devastating the impact was for survivors. Forced sterilization was not hidden, and it was actually a part of the United States federal policy and medical practice. This history continues to reflect how Indigenous women are treated in prison today.
This history began with settler colonialism, a system where settlers took land and tried to erase Indigenous communities. It is not just a one-time event, but it is an ongoing system that still impacts Indigenous people today. It does not just take their land, it also takes Indigenous women's ability to survive and reproduce.
That is such an important connection to understand, especially when we look at how these systems work together. In our interview with Dr. Roddy, she explained how forced sterilization is a way of colonial control that harms Indigenous sovereignty.
By, especially when we talk about sterilization, right, kind of essentially that in and of itself is essentially a harm on reproductive justice because it takes away decision-making power from Indigenous individuals because motherhood is considered kind of such a social threat for Indigenous people, right? That the continuation of a particular sovereign group of people inherently kind of endangers the power that, colonizers have in, this environment, right?
Like Dr. Roddy said, motherhood is seen as a threat when it comes to Indigenous women. This is not just about healthcare, it is about power. The power over who gets to create life and who gets punished for it.
Exactly. And when that kind of mindset is in places like prison, and the state allows forced sterilization to happen there, it keeps the cycle of colonialism going. The methods of colonialism may change, but the purpose is still to control Indigenous people and limit their future.
This is why we cannot talk about forced sterilization without also talking about incarceration. For Indigenous women, both of these issues are shaped by settler colonialism and control that aim to erase their identity, culture, and future.
Now that we have talked about forced sterilization and how it connects to incarceration, our next focus is what reproductive justice and maternal health care look like in the prison system today.
Unfortunately, there's not a lot of access to general health care in prisons, and reproductive care is even more difficult to access.
So what exactly is reproductive justice?
Reproductive justice is about more than just the right to decide whether or not to have children. This justice means being able to make informed decisions about your own body and having access to health care that is safe and culturally appropriate.
In prisons, this standard is not met. Inmates typically have almost no control over their bodies or the care they receive. Referring back to our interview with Dr. Roddy, she explained how reproductive justice is connected to Indigenous communities.
The fact that Western medicine is so, it's so not holistic. Like when Indigenous people, and I don't want to paint with a broad brush because of course all Indigenous cultures are different, but my experiences with my tribe and as I've talked to Indigenous healthcare providers, one of the most important things in their practice is making sure that their care is holistic and that their care is culturally relevant.
As you heard Dr. Roddy say, holistic healthcare is very important in Indigenous culture, but this is not a part of Western medicine and definitely not available in prison.
Exactly. This is especially true in prison, where access to mental health services is also difficult to access.
This is especially important when you consider the fact that Indigenous women are incarcerated at much higher rates than other populations. In 2010, Indigenous women made up 2.5% of incarcerated women, but only made up 0.7% of the total United States female population.
When talking about reproductive justice in Arizona prisons, Perryville is a clear example of this because it had multiple reported issues when it comes to reproductive justice and maternal care.
Women inside Perryville prison have written letters telling their stories about the reproductive harm they have experienced while incarcerated.
Women have reported having their labor induced before their due date without their consent.
Jocelyn Hefner had been pregnant twice while incarcerated in Perryville, and both times she argued against having her labor induced. She said,
I felt like I was viewed as a liability, and walking around a prison yard 9 months pregnant didn't comfort this state institution.
Another woman who had been incarcerated while pregnant in Perryville was induced a week before her due date without her consent. She said,
I'm quite used to the prison making all these decisions for us, because we are still state property. They induce us all now so that we don't go into labor in prison.
When we connect this to what we learned earlier about forced sterilization and settler colonialism, it shows how prisons are still used to control Indigenous women.
These testimonies show why reproductive justice in prisons is so important. It is not just about healthcare, but it is about Indigenous women's dignity, safety, and right to be treated like a person.
In today's episode, we talked about how forced sterilization and reproductive justice are closely connected to settler colonialism and incarceration. We discussed the harm Indigenous women face both in the past and present, and why it is so important to have healthcare in prisons that meet their needs and respect their culture.
We need to recognize the systemic issues in prisons and why reproductive justice matters for Indigenous women. We can make a difference in the criminal justice system, and it begins by informing ourselves. We encourage you to educate yourself more and listen to the stories of Indigenous women to better understand their perspectives on these issues.
Thank you all for listening to Punishment in the High Country, and thank you to Dr. Roddy for taking the time to share her insights with us. If you found this episode meaningful, please consider subscribing, rating, or sharing it with others. Every action taken helps spread awareness of this issue. This has been your host, Taylor Bullman
And Emily Presto.